We all experience some measure of growth through the process of living. And we recognize this growth in that in some way it bestows upon us a more adequate attitude, a more reasonable point of view, or greater courage of decision and determination when need arises. A person said to me not long ago, when I was growing up, I had a very bad temper. But I worked on it quite sincerely, and now my temper is more controllable, and I am less likely to give way to blind impulses or negative attitudes. So this person concluded, I think I have grown a little through the years. Thus we think of growing as a progressive process of self-improvement. Sometimes we feel that it is thrust upon us, more or less against our wills. Other times we strenuously attempt to cultivate some sense of increasing ability to cope with circumstances. Growth is a word, however, which applied to the inner life of man is rather abstract, confusing, and it is used very loosely to cover a wide variety of processes which we do not really understand. Perhaps the architect has something to offer in this particular phase of our living. A man designing a house watches day by day the physical structure growing and developing through layer upon layer of stone or masonry, or through the continuous efforts of artisans who by degrees bring the structure to completeness. This process of bringing things to completeness by naturally and inevitably slow procedures sort of reminds us of the idea of building personal character. To the thoughtful person, growth is not a sudden leap toward light. Growth in man, as in nature, is a slow, regular, continuous, almost imperceptible procedure. Without the assistance of special types of cameras, we cannot watch plants grow. But we do know that if we return several days later and view the plant, we can observe the changes in it, the unfoldment and enlargement of it, and we see that it is filling gradually the archetype of its own kind. Growth is not something we can measure always in terms of moments, but it is something that accumulates, becoming a gradually increasing force for the attainment of some end which we desire or we regard as necessary and proper. Now, when we study man, the question always seems to arise as to what part of man actually grows. We know the physical body develops and reaches maturity, that a growth does take place there. But having once achieved its own maturity, the body continues on a more or less level platform for the greater part of life, and then shows definite signs of decline. The physical person does grow, but it is impossible to conceive this growth as being identical with the development of the person inhabiting this body. To a measure, there seems to be a connection. We know that we have come to expect degrees of physical growth to be associated with consistent degrees of mental development. We do not expect the small child to be an intellectual. We do not expect the small child to grope with problems that are suitable to an adult. We notice, however, that in the course of schooling, the growing child gains certain familiarity with knowledge and gradually comes into the possession of a group of facts which in turn he can use to extend his own insight beyond these facts themselves into their reasonable implications. He has been provided by education with a basic group of elements of knowledge. And by making proper or the best use of these elements, he realizes that he can enrich his life and can gradually gain skill or proficiency in some chosen field. We also know that one kind of growing is more or less completed in the educational process. By the time the person has graduated from high school or college or whatever the case may be, it is assumed that he has received the primary instruments upon which to build or with which to build a mental life. He has been taught with some reservations how to use the various faculties of his own mind. He has learned to solve academic problems. He has learned to unite elements of knowledge to form new levels of knowing. So he starts out reasonably certain that he is well informed. It is not long, however, before he discovers the necessity for another faculty, a faculty that is not based entirely upon textbook knowledge, but which perhaps we may call judgment. Judgment is something that matures more slowly than knowledge in its own proper form. We can amass a great many facts, and having possessed these facts, or having come into an awareness of them, we can go along through the years counting our facts. We can bring them into the forepart of the mind at will. We can use them to interpret other facts, or to recognize things similar to those which we have learned. But there comes a time after schooling ends, usually, where the person is forced to face personal judgment, personal responsibility, and to make personal decisions. This seems to require other forms of knowledge. And out of all of the basic schooling that he has gained, there must come a certain overtone, some ability to cope with things not directly learned, but about which learning offers some assistance. As we go along through life, of course, we are inclined to specialize our activities, and as a result of this process, to accumulate more facts in some areas than in others. Because we have more available facts, we are more proficient in these areas. But always there is a dividing line between the workman, we might say, and the executive. The executive is the person who seems to be able to use knowledge more adroitly. The executive seems to have certain capacities and certain skills by means of which his contribution is more dynamic than that of the person who simply has remembered a large area of information. Some fields of activity do not call for much mental executive effort. Others depend heavily on it for the success of enterprise. So looking inside of ourselves and trying to analyze the structure of our own natures, we realize that through the sensory perceptions, as we have already discussed them in the previous talks of this series, and in cooperation with the mental coordinating power, that we do come to certain rather vivid conclusions about things. We are able to arrive at judgments. We are able to go a little beyond what might be termed the body of our facts and become in a measure prophetic. We sense larger meanings, although we may not possess the full understanding of them. We realize that it is possible to continue to apply the knowledge that we accumulate beyond the call of duty, that there are certain duties that we have to perform, but that we can live above and beyond the necessary, moving gradually and resolutely toward more ideal situations or larger uses of knowledge. Growth implies not only the possession of an increasing amount of available insight, but also the factor of experience. And experience is conferred only by active participation in life problems. Growth perhaps comes more directly from the pressure of experience than from any other single cause. It is the emergency which forces man to draw out of himself all available mental resources. As the problems around him intensify, the individual must solve them from himself, or with faculties and powers within himself. If he is in a comparatively secure condition, if his wants are few or his needs are easily met, it follows that for the most part he will not be challenged. And because he is not challenged by circumstances, he does not experience as intensely as those who must face and meet difficult situations. So growth has a great deal to do with the experiencing of the relationship between knowledge and fact. If everything that we learned was absolutely true, and if every situation that arose in life was completely academic, there would be very little growth. We could take the information that we learned in kindergarten and apply it to the problems of mature years. But we find that this is not the case. We observe that the individual, proceeding down through the years, is constantly required to face situations which he is not able to adequately meet. One of the common situations here is our inability to visualize, even abstractly, the number of possible situations that can arise in life. The old Jesuit father, Athanasius Kirchhoff, made an effort to estimate some of these incredible factors. He found that a comparatively small group of basic units, perhaps not more than 20 or 30, could be brought into so many conceivable combinations that an individual writing down these combinations at the rate of 10,000 a minute could not live long enough to write them all down. In other words, a comparatively small group of basic situations can result in combinations extending into these billions of billions. This means that in our experience, no two situations will ever be exactly alike. And none of them will ever be exactly alike the example in the textbook. This can be taken for granted. I remember a young doctor who had recently hung out his shingle, and one of his earliest problems was an acute appendicitis. He thought back very, very carefully to his experience in dissection. He also brought out all the books and the charts to make sure that he knew where everything was when he got started. As the operation proceeded, his confusion grew. The appendix was not where it was supposed to be. He discussed it later with another doctor, and the doctor smilingly said, "Think nothing of it. It never is. Whatever you may expect, that it will not be." So the individual, having learned certain broad expectations, finds that from the moment he begins to live, he must apply a certain measure of individual ingenuity to the situations that arise. They are not going to be academic. They are not going to be the probable and the expected. In every combination of factors, there is something that seems to make that combination uniquely difficult. To face this unique difficulty, the person must therefore add to his general knowledge a certain resourcefulness. He must be prepared for emergencies. He must adjust to them. And he must have certain imagination, a power to experience the possibilities of things and be prepared for them. Thus, growing has something to do with the enlarging of the area of the known patterns into which circumstances conform themselves as the result of constant contact with those patterns. This means further that through each experience that occurs, the individual adds something to his basic fund of knowledge. This fund, therefore, grows constantly unless the person closes his mind to growth. Assuming that he is a normal individual, he finds that this increasing fund of knowledge provides him with greater securities. He is less likely to be surprised. He is less likely to be bewildered. His expectations have no longer the very close patterns which come from theoretical knowledge. As he goes along, therefore, he experiences a greater resourcefulness. He experiences greater assurance. And as the skilled surgeon, after many surgical experiences, gains a certain facility to handle emergencies. He senses and knows what to do because he has been faced with numerous situations before. And out of his growing experience patterns, he is able to come to more immediately useful conclusions about situations wherein he may be not entirely adequate or informed. So this process of growth for us is simply the heaping up of greater resources in ourselves. And as these resources increase, we observe a more satisfactory personal relationship with life. Now, in the grand days years ago of popular metaphysics, we had terms which were rather delightful and naive, and many people took them quite seriously. An individual who seemed to be especially well integrated, or extremely learned, or profoundly experienced, was referred to as an old soul. This individual had been on the road a long time. He had passed through many different situations. He had become adapted and adjusted to the emergencies of existence. Another person who appeared to be what we now term a perpetual adolescent was referred to in those gay days as a young soul, one just starting out. Why one was older than another was not exactly explained, but it was assumed that perhaps down through time or eternity, what we call the old soul had been especially diligent in learning, whereas the so-called young soul, who might have started out at the same time, simply played hooky too often from school, did not gain the necessary experiences or had slight aptitude for learning. Thus, the idea of the old soul was simply one that appeared to be patriarchal in achievement, to have a fuller and richer kind of life. Now, there's no doubt in the world that people are born with different degrees of insight and different degrees of resolution. It seems that some from the beginning have an aptitude for knowledge of some kind. Others appear to be deficient in this aptitude. Some are naturally thoughtful. Others appear to be born thoughtless and never seem to recover. But all, in one way or another, have to grow. They grow because either thoughtfulness or thoughtlessness will ultimately result in situations that force growth. To us, then, the idea of growth is this constantly unfolding capacity to solve problems. Now, that would be something we would all like to have in large measure at the present time, because there has never been a day that we know of when problems were as numerous or the needs for true knowledge more immediate and acute. So we turn into ourselves to search for whatever it is that is the source of this growth factor in our consciousness. And we find that this factor, like nearly all of the other elements of our problem, lies within this chemistry of sensory and mental processes. What we call growth is the gradual organization of the faculties, powers, perceptions, reflections, which make up the equipment of the person. He is growing because he is taking more in and understanding it better. There seems to be no question as to this. Growth, as it applies to our conditions in this world, must, to a measure at least, depend upon our ability to interpret and understand this world. We may assume that we have another life entirely apart from mortality, but our existence in the material universe and our adjustment to its problems seem to require that we become increasingly aware of the laws, patterns, purposes, plans, and processes that operate here. The only way that we can really become aware of our relationship to environment is to become more familiar with the laws governing environment itself. What we term growth in this case is adjustment. It is the individual becoming sufficiently equipped to lead a serene existence in the material sphere. To gain this serenity, he must begin to study this mortal existence, how it is organized, how it functions, what contributes to problem and what contributes to the solution of problem. To most persons, this knowledge is not sought voluntarily, at least in many instances. It is a byproduct. It is the byproduct of the simple process of living itself. The individual learns by doing. This is a kind of an apprenticeship system, and our material existence seems to be an apprenticeship. We learn by observing the actions of others. We learn by experiencing the results of our own actions. And, of course, to a measure, we learn from the long traditional patterns of the activity of our social group. All these things become elements in growth or in development. The beginning of growth, as the Greek philosophers pointed out, is therefore a keen sense of value. The individual must be able to perceive. He must be able to gain reports through the sensory perceptions about occurrences. And these reports must be a little more important, a little more real, a little more clear than in the case of the average person. One of the ways, of course, to make the testimony of the senses more valuable is to give greater personal attention to these testimonies. Things that go in one ear and out the other do not contribute too much to our conscious life, although they may be subconsciously recorded. The individual, to get the most out of the experiences, must focus attention upon experiences. They must be things important in themselves. He must have a tendency to weigh and examine and estimate the results of his own conduct. If he is indifferent to his own conduct, if he is unable to perceive any patterns between his actions and their consequences, he is not gaining very much in the form of experience. Experience is not just what happens. Experience is the ability of the individual to interpret what happens. If his interpretation is wrong, the experience does not contribute to his growth directly. Ultimately, however, his mistake will become the basis of a further experience in which the mistake must be corrected. But a person who is prejudiced, highly opinionated, fanatical, or bigoted will not correctly interpret experience. So an immoderate attitude on the one hand and a lack of interest on the other will both reduce the importance of the experience factor. Experience must be accepted with an open mind and must be subjected to the best processes of thought which we are capable of bringing to bear upon it. An experience, therefore, is an open invitation to growth. But this invitation is not forced upon us. We can ignore the experience, we can repeat the mistakes, we can evade the responsibility for our own actions, and thus we can slow down this thing that we call growth. If we are really here to grow, and most philosophies assume that we are, then, of course, it is important for us to make the most of every opportunity to grow. And we can perhaps find some parallels for these circumstances in other departments of life. A non-artist, looking at a scene in the forest or on the side of a hill, will observe the same general physical forms that an artist will see. The artist, however, if he is going to paint this picture, must have an acute sense of proportion and color. An artist painting a tree will not paint it exactly as a non-artist will see that tree. If you ask the non-artist what color the tree is, he will say it is brown. At least the trunk is brown. But when the artist paints that brown trunk, he may use from 5 to 15 different colors to get that brown. He may paint what looks to us to be a plain gray shadow, but when he paints it, it may be green, violet, it may be brown, it may have deep reds in it, it may have many, many colors that to the untrained eye are not perceived. Yet if the artist is skillful and he finally completes his painting and frames it and hangs it on the wall, and the non-artist looks at it, the non-artist will see the tree as he himself saw it. But he will not realize that it required a very deep understanding of color to produce, by means of paint, the very simple shades which appeared to be in the structure of the tree. The artist had a specialized color sense, and he realized how many colors it took to make a tree look brown. Now, in this way, a philosopher or a mystic, looking at life, sees much more than the person who is thoughtless or indifferent or unskilled or ungifted in these areas. As we become more thoughtful, however, and we are sincerely concerned with the processes of self-improvement, we naturally become more attentive to details, also to masses. We begin to study the elements which make up patterns. These are no longer simply colors as we know them on a painter's palette. Lord Bacon called these moral colors the colors of good and evil. And there is a beautiful sense of value there. The discovery of the infinite tonalities of incidents. How we are to take these comparatively simple situations and actually find their meaning. Or if the situations appear to be hopelessly complicated, how we can gradually reduce them to their essential elements. Thus it is true that there will always be in the world some who, looking at the tree, will see nothing of interest. And there will also be a few who, looking at the same tree, will discover it to be a wonder of creation. The attitude has much to do with it. Now, where does the attitude come from? Why are some persons apparently born thoughtful and others born thoughtless? The answer has to be that the individual brings forward into present activities the substance and essence of previous attainment. We are not starting. We are not individuals beginning at this time with a new and complete nature. We are all somewhere midstream in the great process of evolution. And while it is true that the differences in various persons may seem very great, actually these differences are not as tremendous as might first appear. They are differences within a comparatively small pattern of possibilities. But these differences seem to be large, and in the course of life seem to produce very large and often conflicting results. In the general study of mysticism, and I think in a sense are thinking about the Buddhist machine of the sensory perceptions, we do gradually come to realize that the highest testimony of these perceptions will be the ability to perceive the depth of value in things. Perhaps we can say it in another way, that the end of the perceptive process is that we shall see all of a matter. That the perceptions will reveal to us everything that it is possible for them to confirm. That all these perceptions, acting completely as far as their own natures are concerned, will each of them produce a maximum of testimony, and will allow this testimony to move in to the central coordinating power. If all of the sensory perceptions are fully developed so that everything which they can know or can discover is conveyed, the coordinator then has the fullest possible means of estimating the situation under consideration. If all the testimonies of the senses unite, as in the case or example given by Immanuel Kant, in the description of an apple, if all of these sensory testimonies convey their own fullest support in the consideration of the object, the ultimate will be that the coordinator will have a full and complete concept of an apple. Each one of the faculties will have contributed a supporting or sustaining testimony. One by one, they remove doubts left by the deficiencies of each other, until in the end, no doubt remains. This is an apple. So the great problem that these faculties are all afflicted by is that they are sensitive and subject to a kind of hallucination. Studies in suggestion therapy indicate the area of difficulty. The faculties can be conditioned away from normalcy. Faculties can be taught not to function, or they can be taught to function by a very special kind of training, so that this function is no longer normal, accurate, or true. Also, the testimonies which they bring in, like the evidence of witnesses in a court trial, these testimonies, this evidence, if it is placed in the hands of a corrupted judge, will not result in an honest verdict. If the mental coordinator is corrupted, if the coordinator is unable to function as it should, the testimonies of the sensory perceptions are distorted and deformed, and the verdict arrived at in the mind will not be right. An example of this, of course, is the problem of style and various passing moods of tradition and schools of thought. For example, some years ago, certain impressionistic artists produced some rather strange and mysterious productions. To most people, these productions were meaningless. Some were extremely distasteful. Still others really hurt the person who tried to look at them. And a little trip through the Museum of Modern Art in New York can be a pretty soul-disturbing adventure. But after 12, 20, 30, 40 years of the modern art trend, we found people beginning to ask each other such questions as, is it good? Or am I wrong? This person says it's wonderful. That critic says it's the noblest job that was ever done. Certain person has just bought this picture for $75,000. I don't like it. Am I crazy? Is the man who bought it crazy? What is wrong with what? Or who? And gradually, out of familiarity, out of constant indoctrination in this way, persons who really do not like modern art convince themselves or are convinced by others that it is good and it is important. And first thing you know, we find one of these strange pictures hanging on the wall of one of their rooms. They still do not know what is good about it. They still subconsciously do not like it, but they feel that they should. After all, everyone cannot be wrong. Now we have the same thing in religious bigotry. If we belong to a group of people in which perhaps we know that there are millions who hold the same extremely traditional points of view, that are just as conservative as they want us to be, and yet we feel that these ideas are too small, we are gradually subjected to indoctrination. In time, we may become just as narrow-minded as the person whom we might resent, simply because in due course we have sold ourselves an attitude which destroys for us the validity of our own experience. In a more personal way, an individual will develop gradually a habit of being sorry for themselves. Self-pity is a very pitiable condition, yet many people develop it. After a time of being sorry for ourselves, we establish a habit pattern. And in the due course, practically every testimony that comes in to our sensory structure is distorted or in some way exaggerated so that it will appear to contribute to our own misery. In this way, we can continue to become more and more sorry for ourselves. Experience finally ends as nothing but the final justification that we have been picked out of the universe to be made miserable. Every other factor is lost. Nothing is recorded but that which supports the intensity of our own viewpoint. Now, no one is completely clear of viewpoint. Some have it in larger doses than others. But we all have certain attitudes, certain convictions, certain beliefs that to us are just frightfully important. We cannot conceive of any fact being in conflict with what we want to believe. So we proceed to eliminate the fact rather than change ourselves. When these types of attitudes become fixed in our natures, we cease to grow. Growth is blocked, therefore, by any attitude which destroys the free circulation of facts in our own consciousness. The individual who is no longer able to look at a fact and say, I was wrong. A person who cannot do this is cutting off his own experience benefits very definitely. Experience almost always must lead us, finally, to the correction of our own conduct into conformity with the reality of the matter under analysis or thought. The moment we try to force the fact to change, we are in trouble. Facts will not change. But we can imagine that they do, and can go on for a long time deluding ourselves in these particulars. But wherever delusion comes in, the facts become less available. It is as though the light of reason was obscured by a heavy fog, the fog of our own opinions. In the problem of yoga, or in the mystical disciplines of the Near East and ancient times, one of the ways to grow was to clear the channels by means of which man is aware of life. As long as these channels are blocked or obscured by false attitudes, the person cannot grow graciously. He makes so many mistakes that nature becomes an instrument of retribution for that person. Nature seems to turn on him and hurt him. Nature hasn't turned at all. The individual has only gotten into such a bad relationship with nature that he is hurting himself. In the machinery of cognition, anything which destroys the smooth running of the machine is bad. I remember in the old days when we had bookkeepers and accountants who didn't have computers and things of that nature, and had to work it out almost entirely with their own basic knowledge of mathematics. Many of them did not even have an adding machine. And in the old days, when the adding machine was first introduced, those who had not been trained to use it considered it a very unpleasant device and continued to do it in the old way. But there was a terrible catastrophe when the bookkeeper, having about 40 or 50 different number patterns in his mind, and just getting them drawn together, was interrupted by someone talking to him. The entire pattern that he had added up sort of dissipated instantly, and he had to start all over again. In other words, he was interrupted, his mind was turned away from the sum that he was gradually adding together, and if this happened too often, the poor old man frequently got a little irritated about the whole thing. The same process takes place within our own thinking. If we are building up a beautiful pattern of consistent and related subjects and matters, if we are gradually getting at the facts of a case, and then a prejudice flashes into the situation, or the individual suddenly turns against fact by some subconscious process in himself, the whole structure falls apart. All of the validity of the gradually forming pattern is broken up, and the mind has to start again to put the pieces together. To meet this, our ancient brethren always insisted that the only way to gain the greatest amount of experience is to reduce the personal equation in the use and estimation of experience. The personal equation is always one that is very highly tinctured by personal desire and personal advantage. Where this becomes too strong, facts will never be known. So to gradually reduce the pressures of artificial elements over-influencing or interfering with the natural arrival of the mind at its conclusions, these interferences and obstacles have to be gradually eliminated. This was the reason why the meditational processes were set up. They were intended to reveal to the person the possibility of being unconditioned in his own nature in the acceptance of facts. If he could be neutral as far as the fact was concerned, he could then receive the honest report of his own coordinating faculties. if he could get this honest report distorted in no way whatsoever, then he was in the position to use the greatest degree of fact in the solution of some problem of his own. If he had these facts and had them clearly set in his own mind, he could then make decisions which were useful, which advanced his condition, and which contributed to what we call his growth. So the growth of reason in the individual was simply the unfoldment of the power to be reasonable in all things. To be reasonable means to avoid exaggeration. It means also not to overlook small things because of the pressure of masses. It meant very definitely not to overlook virtues in other people because we do know that they have vices. It means not to overlook the importance of ideas because those ideas do not mean too much to us at the moment. It is this process of getting greater thoroughness into all of the procedures of life. What is it then that is adding all this up? What is the instrument by means of which the record of the unfoldment of our faculties is preserved? Buddha would say that it is the sattva, or the self. It is this thing which, though not an essential reality, is a continuing, functioning force, or power, or vortex of energy over a very long period of time. The sattva, or self, the ego, is nothing but the immediate substance of the known and the unknown. It is the mysterious compound of what we do understand and what we do not understand. Thus, whatever part of the thing we understand has a certain luminous quality. The parts that we do not understand are dark and mysterious. And this luminosity and this darkness make the lights and shadows, or contrasts, in our thinking. Wherever we are aware, wherever we know the true shapes of things appear, where we do not know, imaginary forms seem to fill in the mysterious gray intervals. The child who is a little afraid of the hole in the dark may be frightened at the thought of entering a dark closet. They may conceive this closet to be the opening of a great pit leading into mystery, madness, and death. And small children are frequently afraid of these holes in the dark. Yet we all have these. For wherever there are areas within ourselves of the unknown, they are the areas of mystery. And mystery is closely related to misery. Wherever this darkness has no definition that we can truly see, we are going to imagine definitions. We are going to always populate darkness with danger. We are going to be afraid of it. We are going to be prejudiced against it. And we simply cannot realize or believe that darkness is simply an area of the commonplace upon which the light of fact has not yet been cast. But with light and shadow forever mingling in our activities, the sattva, or the self, is the strange blending of hope, which is of light, fear, which is of darkness, good, which is of light, evil, which is of darkness. Always there will be the danger that we will need some form of knowledge that is not available because it is still in a dark area. The egotist doesn't believe in dark areas. He believes that whatever he does see is all light. And because he is overconvinced of his own knowledge, he falls easily prey to his ignorance. He is therefore the easiest of all persons to deceive and exploit. Actually, the personality, the ego, is this mysterious alchemical mixture of the known and the unknown. And whatever elements are composing this, each of these elements also has its known and its unknown factors. Even to the greatest mathematician, there are facts of mathematics still dark. Even to the merest child beginning to reach out into the mystery of material existence, there are still small areas of light. Nothing is completely light, nothing completely dark. No science has exhausted all its mystery. No art has perfected all its works. In everything, there is a light in the midst of darkness. There are the areas of the known against the vast areas of the unknown. And in man's experience, that which he has experienced is light. That which he has not experienced is darkness. And his ego is composed of the fusion of these two. The strange marbleized pattern of light and dark. This wonderful mosaic of alternate colored stones. And everywhere, at every time in life, the decisions that we make, the attitudes that we hold, the conclusions that we reach, are in perfect conformity to these areas of light and darkness within ourselves. Where there is darkness within ourselves, there can be no certainty in our decision. Where there is light within ourselves, there is a measure of certainty. But in experience itself, we realize that all certainties finally vanish again into uncertainties, and that no matter how much man knows, he is forever surrounded by a sea or area of the unknown, which is vaster than any possible achievement or attainment which man himself can hope to achieve. Yet by the very circumstance of nature, man is not required to have light beyond those problems with which he is concerned. He is not expected to function in a universe for which he has no faculties of adjustment. Thus, for him, light and darkness are comparatively simple factors. Factors in which light more or less tells how far we have come, and darkness warns of how far we have yet to go.